Concept 13.2 is about how prey respond to predators, but the evolutionary selective pressures that are exerted upon prey by predators. So both predators and prey exert pressure on each other. However, predators exert stronger selection pressure on their prey. And this is true for both animals and plants. And that's because if you think about it, if you're a predator and you lose that interaction with the prey, you're going to lose your dinner, which is bad, but it's not fatal. Whereas if you're a prey and you lose the interaction with the predator, you lose your life. And so there's a lot more at stake for prey than for predators. So we're going to focus mostly on those interactions. So these adaptations to avoid being eaten fall into 5 general categories. Structural or physical defense, chemical defense, warning, coloration, mimicry, and behavior. First, we'll talk about structure or physical defenses. There are several different kinds of defenses, and one is large size, as exhibited by this African elephant. This elephant is so large that as an adult, there are no predators except for humans. Now, it's not true when they're small, but when they're adults, they are too big to being eaten. And that works for some animals, but not for all. Take, for example, this Thompson's gazelle. Instead of being large, which has a big cost to it, in that you need a lot of energy to upkeep that large body size, you have the gazelle, which uses speed and defensive maneuvers. The gazelle actually will bound and jump very high to get away from its predators. Other large mammals, like deer, will turn and use different maneuvers where predators can't keep up. Predators may be able to run very fast in a straight line, but it's very hard for them to keep up with the defensive maneuvers. Other structural or physical defenses include spines, like on the California sea urchin, hairs, like on the western forest tent caterpillar. It's not very fun to eat things that are very hairy. You don't like to eat them, neither do other animals. Or body armor, as in the California desert tortoise. In plants, it's very similar. Spines, like in cactus, hairs, such as in lupin, and again, we don't like to eat hairy plants. Think about artichoke hearts. We like to take the hair out of them. Leaves can be very tough, as in coast live oak, or they can have bad texture, like the silica found in horsetail. Second kind of defense are chemical defenses, or toxins. One of the more famous local examples of this is the California newt. California newt comes out and mates during the rainy season, or just after it's rained. They're bright orange in color. They're very, very slow moving. You can see these in the forests around the bay. They are very soft-bodied, so they'd be very good to eat. However, they have a very powerful neurotoxin. It's the same neurotoxin, actually, that's found in pufferfish, which is on the lower left-hand corner. This toxin is about 100 times more toxic than cyanide, so it is very deadly. Large milkweed bugs feed on milkweed, which is a plant which also has a lot of these chemicals which are toxic, and it can actually sequester them and itself turn poisonous. I should also say on the California newt that the toxin, they believe, is being made by bacteria and not by the newt itself. The newt somehow can co-opt that toxin, which kind of is the theme when we look at toxins in animals. In plants, they're sometimes called secondary chemicals or secondary compounds, and I know that your book also uses this term. I don't like to use this term. So the historical use of this term comes from community ecology before we knew what these chemicals were for. And we thought these chemicals at that point were just secondary to primary metabolism. That is just kind of accidents of metabolism. Now we know they're not. We know that these were specifically designed by natural selection as defensive compounds. So I like to call them plant defensive compounds instead. I just want to part with the book a little on that one. But let's look at some of the array of compounds in plants. Plants have a whole host of different kinds of these chemical compounds. I don't expect you to memorize the different chemical classifications, but I do find it interesting that there are these different classifications, and that has to do with the different chemical compounds within the toxin. So you have your terpenoids, like mint and pine oils, and we may like them. We may like the way they smell, and for mints, we may like the way they taste, but a lot of insects and animals don't like them. Phenylpropanes like cinnamon and clove. Cinnamon is bark of a tree. Again, we like it, but a lot of organisms don't. So the plant's not making these special compounds just because we like them. It's making it actually as a defense. What's really interesting is if you do live in the California or San Francisco Bay Area and you have a problem with Argentine ants, which are the common house ants in our area, if you sprinkle cinnamon across a line of foraging ants, you'll notice that immediately they disperse and they will not cross that line because, again, cinnamon is a defensive compound. We have our nitrogen-containing compounds, like our alkaloids. These will be things like caffeine, nicotine, cocoa. They're fast-acting, effective neurotoxins. In fact, if you drink caffeine in the form of coffee or tea, you will notice that it is a neurotoxin. And in fact, in purified caffeine, it takes less than 2 teaspoons of purified caffeine to kill you. So it can be deadly even to humans. But remember that for the most part, the plants are making these toxins to counteract insects and not mammals. So even just a little bit for an insect is deadly. And then we have our digestibility reducers, or phenolics, like tannins and resins, commonly found in plants that are very obvious for herbivores, something like an oak tree in the middle of an oak savanna or grassland. These are primarily nitrogen-based compounds, and they inhibit digestion. So they bind to the proteins that are digestible, but they make them indigestible. So these can account to up to 60% of the dry weight of plants such as oak trees. And the way these work is they're dose dependent. So instead of those fast-acting neurotoxins, these are actually chemicals which are such that the more you eat, the less digestible they are, and so they work better. Plants also make hormone mimics, which interfere with normal insect development. For example, potatoes. Potatoes are very interesting. They have another defense. They're in the family Solanaceae. So they do present or do make their own toxins. That's why you don't eat the leaves of a potato plant or the green parts of a potato. However, they also produce an aphid alarm pheromone. Now, a pheromone is similar to a hormone. A hormone is a chemical signal that goes from one part of your body to another. A pheromone acts as a chemical signal from one organism to another organism, but of the same species. And in this case, it produces a pheromone that's normally produced by aphids that warn other aphids in a group that there's a predator present. Instead, the potato has taken that chemical compound and will produce it and warn others that there's a predator around, even if there isn't. So it kind of fools the aphid. African bugleweed produces hormones that actually cause abnormal development in caterpillars that eat them. If a caterpillar eats it, they'll turn into butterflies, which have 2 heads and abnormal mouth parts. Other hormone mimics include this in the firs. It's a whole genus of plants, trees. They produce an insect hormone that inhibits metamorphosis of their insect herbivores. So what happens is the insects never actually turn into adults. If you see on the lower left, the normal development, and those are the different stages of the insect as they move from juvenile to adult. So they undergo what we call incomplete metamorphosis, where the young look a lot like the older ones, but they just don't have developed sexual parts or wings. Whereas when they're feeding on this hormone, which prevents metamorphosis, what just happens is that the juveniles just grow bigger and bigger, but never sexually develop. So again, it's a hormone mimic, and it prevents the insect from actually reproducing. Other chemical defenses include white clover, another very common plant. It's not a native plant in California, but it is another common plant we find. It's found all over the lawns on City College. White clover or Trifolium repens. And this is what we call an inducible defense. So in this, the plant and the leaves actually make a precursor to the toxin that it holds in the leaves, and that it will only complete the making of that toxin, which is a form of cyanide, if there is some damage to the leaf. And in this way, the plant can save energy. It doesn't have to waste the energy on making the final compound, which doesn't last long. And it can hold it, and it only makes it when it's needed. So this kind of defense, an inducible defense, is very common in plants. We come to our third category of adaptations, and these are warning colorations, sometimes called aposematic colorations. And this is colorations that are kind of the warning in nature. And you'll know this. If you see certain patterns in nature, you kind of know to be frightened. If you see this, if you look at the yellow jacket on the upper right, that classic yellow and black striping is a warning in nature. Red colors, like the red velvet ant on the bottom left, is also a warning color. When we see red, we usually think poisonous. In this case, it's not an ant. The red velvet ant is actually a wasp in its own family, Mutilidae, and they pack a very powerful sting. The females do. Their nickname is cow killers. So they're also mimics of ants, but they are wasps. And then we have our poison dart frogs, which again are a warning coloration. Some other local and examples that are in the news more lately will be the yellow-bellied sea snake, which is just being spotted off the coast of California. Highly venomous species. This one normally you wouldn't find off the coast of California, but because of the warm El Niño waters, we're seeing it recently. And the Hopkins rose nudibranch, which used to be very rare in California, but in the last year or so, we've been seeing a lot of them in tide pools. Nudibranchs are sea slugs, very colorful, very slow-moving, don't have a lot of defense, physical defense, but they do have these bright colors which indicate they are poisonous, and in fact they are. Our fourth type of prey adaptation to mimic prey adaptation to predation is mimicry. And there's different kinds of mimicry. There's our Batesian mimicry, or Mullerian mimicry, and finally our crypsis, or camouflage. Now, I'm not going to parse too much that Batesian versus Mullerian mimicry, but I do want you, pardon me, to understand that there are different kinds of mimics. So Batesian mimicry is the kind probably that you're most familiar with. Excuse me. It's where the coloration mimics the warning coloration of toxic species. So in this case, we have the eastern coral snake, which is venomous, highly venomous. And on the right, we have the scarlet king snake, which is non-venomous, but it's taken on the same warning coloration as a venomous snake. It's kind of a cheater in the system. This only works if the mimic is in relatively low density. Because if you think about it, if you're a predator and you come across this organism and it's warning you that it's poisonous, but in fact it's not, and you discover it's not, you're more likely to go after it in the future. Excuse me. Except if you're more likely to encounter the venomous kind, then you will avoid the non-venomous kind. Many instances of this Batesian mimicry are being reevaluated now. Again, it's biology, and so we're not really sure always. We don't always have the answers. There's always more questions. So the one that you probably were taught about when you were younger is the monarch butterfly. Monarch butterfly feeds on a group of plants known as the milkweeds, which have their own class of toxic chemicals. Now, the monarch only feeds as a caterpillar. Caterpillar feeds on the plants or on the leaves, and it can co-opt those chemicals and keep them inside their cells so that if they in turn are eaten, they will be poisonous. And you do see that as adults, birds will avoid them. They may try them once, but then spit them out really quickly. And if you look at the caterpillar, it has that classic warning coloration, that black and yellow striping. Another butterfly that lives in close proximity to the monarch is the viceroy. For a long time, it was thought that the viceroy was a mimic of the monarch. And indeed, it is a mimic. But it was also found that the viceroy does have some defensive chemicals that it gets from its host plants when it's young. So is it Batesian mimic or not? Maybe, maybe not. But you can see that the caterpillar is a different kind of mimic. And if you look at the caterpillar of the viceroy, it looks very different than the caterpillar of the monarch. So the monarch is advertising that it's poisonous, and it's saying, don't eat me. Whereas the viceroy kind of looks like bird poop. That's a different kind of mimicry, where the insect is mimicking some abiotic element in the environment, in this case, excrement. Another example close to us is the gopher snake and the rattlesnake. Gopher snakes are not poisonous and are not toxic and are pretty harmless, actually. They can grow very large. We do have them in San Francisco, and they look surprisingly like rattlesnakes. In fact, it's hard to tell them apart. The only real difference that you can see is that rattle at the end. And what's interesting is that it's not only a mimic physically, but it's also a mimic behaviorally. If you encounter a gopher snake, it will act like a rattlesnake. So remember, the gopher snake doesn't have defenses, or, I mean, it can bite, but it isn't venomous. And so if you encounter it, it'll start to act like a rattlesnake in that it may coil. It may shake its tail at you. It may even compress its belly to let out air to make it sound like it's rattling. But if you approach it, and I don't advocate you do this, but if you do approach it and it's not a rattlesnake, eventually it will just slither off. Whereas a rattlesnake will coil and possibly strike you. Malarian mimicry, on the other hand, is when you have a bunch of species that mimic each other, but they're all toxic. And again, this is that warning coloration, so it falls into that category. Something like the bees and the wasps, that yellow and black coloration, which warns that I'm toxic or venomous. Again, the red velvet ant, which is a local species, has that same coloration, but they're all toxic. But these are Batesian mimics because they use that warning coloration, but they're not. Hoverflies are flies. They're not bees and not wasps and not venomous at all. The moth on the right, again, not venomous. The hoverfly is also on the lower left, and on the right is the mantid fly, which is mimicking two creatures, the praying mantis, which is a predator, but also that warning coloration of that red and yellow. So these are Batesian mimics. Then we have cryptic coloration, and these are animals that blend in with their environment, sometimes called camouflage. The peppered moth, which we discussed when we talked about evolution or natural selection earlier in the semester. And you can see there's two different morphs. There is the one that is peppered. You can see it right here. And then you can see the one that is brown or black, the dark morph, which is more obvious. Katydids on the right, you can see, are notorious for their cryptic coloration. They often look just like their environment. The leaves, their wings will even mimic the venation in leaves. You can resemble your surroundings, like the coast hoard lizard. Again, this is a subspecies we have that's threatened, but that is a local species. You can find them down in Monterey. When you look at them, they're flat. They look just like rocks. They're very hard to see, and they're sit and wait. They will sit and wait until you walk by, but if you get too close, they'll scuttle away. But they're really slow, and they're very easy to catch. You're not allowed to catch them because they are a protected species. They also have another very interesting defense, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Here are more examples of katydids. These are insects, and see if you can find the insects. So closely resemble their surroundings that they're virtually indistinguishable from their surroundings. But I want to get back to that coast horned lizard, and so here's a short video.
The horned lizard. Its known aliases include the horned frog and the horny toad, but it's no amphibian. Just a one-reptile wrecking crew with a bizarre self-defense strategy. We'll get to that in a second. It eats mostly harvester ants, but it doesn't have any fancy hunting methods. When a foraging column of ants crosses its path, it laps them up. The ants try to fight back, but their mandibles are of little use against the lizard's scales, no matter how hard they try. But a coyote is a different story. And that's when the lizard rolls out its weird defense. It fires its own version of pepper spray. Thin blood vessels around the eyes rupture under pressure and squirt blood out at the attacker. In addition to the ick factor, the blood contains canine repellent chemicals. Disgusted and weirded out, the coyote flees, leaving the lizard to wait for more ants.
So again, that's an example of a crypsis, that the lizard actually looks like its surroundings. But if it's disturbed enough, it has a different defense against being eaten, and that's a behavioral defense. It also has a chemical defense because it does have chemicals in its blood that will repel predators. So some of these other defenses, these cryptic defenses, which sometimes will model different other behavioral defenses, will be things like false targets, like on the chickadee. The birds of prey will normally go after its tail feathers, which it can afford to lose. Eye spots. Eye spots can make an organism look bigger, or it can startle. It actually has a big startle reflex. Or the stripes in zebras. Here's another example of crypsis, and this doesn't have any words to it, but I want you to keep an eye on that plant as this diver getting closer and closer to it. And in fact, it's not a plant. So watch again. They're going to show this in reverse slow motion so you can see just how good this crypsis is. It's just amazing. So the octopus, squid, and cuttlefish are all in the same group, and they have amazing abilities of crypsis and cryptic coloration and mimicry. And part of that is because they're very soft-bodied. They've lost that outer shell. They have very large brains. And I'll put some videos up so that you can watch and you can learn how they do that. It's very interesting how they can mimic their surroundings and also mimic color patterns like the shimmer of water. Here, we'll skip that out. I'm going to put that one up on the web. There's finally behavioral ways that predators or prey avoid predators. Things like warning calls, which we talked about when we talked about behavior, where one member of the group will call out to warn of predators of the others. Foraging sites. A lot of times prey will forage in suboptimal patches or not the optimal foraging area, and that's primarily just to avoid being eaten. So they will choose an area that has refuge for them. This is a deer species of India, and it will forage not in the open grassland, which would be better energetically, but it will forage in forest cover, on forest edges. And then herding behavior, where only individuals get eaten. When you are in a herd, the predator can only really concentrate on one, and usually will concentrate on one of the ones on the edges of the herd. Now, if you're in a herd, usually the ones on the edges are the weaker ones, or the younger ones, or the sicker ones, or the older ones. They're the ones that actually aren't going to be able to fight you off as well. There's something known as prey swamping, where a whole bunch of individuals will be all born at once. These are the Magus cicadas of the east coast of the United States. They have 13 or 17-year life cycles. Different species have different life cycles. And what that means is that if, say, the 13-year ones, that for 12 years they live underground as larvae, and they just eat the roots of plants, and that every 13 years they all emerge at once. And there's so many of them that emerge at once, and it's at such a long interval that predators cannot increase in numbers enough to actually do damage to the population. So it's a way of avoiding predation. Playing dead, so this is a possum, and the possum plays dead in order to avoid being eaten because a lot of predators don't like to eat dead things. In plants, they do the same thing. This will be the timing of life cycles. In plants, it's called masting. In animals, we call it prey swamping. I use them interchangeably. But let's look at bamboo on the left. They all flower and set seed at once. That way, predators can't eat all the seeds at once. Oak trees mast, irregular intervals. So every few years, all the oak trees in a stand, in a population or in a group, will produce acorns. Acorns are a very high valuable food source for animals, and so they usually will get eaten. So in an environment much like we live in California, which is highly variable, that's a very important food source. So if all the oak trees actually produce acorns at once, and a lot of them, the predators of those acorns can't actually eat all of them. And so at least some of them will get by and new oak trees will live. And then there's other kinds of plant behavior. And the whole topic of do plants behave is a little controversial. But plants are showing a lot more sophisticated behavior than we previously thought. So plants can enlist others to help them do their dirty work for them. So this is the case of the tobacco budworm, which is a caterpillar, and it eats tobacco. Now, once this plant is wounded, it sends out chemicals, or it sends out pheromones that attract another insect. So just to keep them all straight, the caterpillar, or the tobacco budworm, is eating the tobacco. The tobacco sends out a call for the predator of the caterpillar, or a parasitoid wasp, to come and eat the budworm. And in this way, it's getting someone to help defend it for it. And it is so species specific that the tobacco can actually tell if it's being eaten by the tobacco worm or the corn budworm. And it will call the appropriate parasite, which is incredibly sophisticated behavior for a plant, if you think about it.